a rotten hooker.
I thought I was a good Christian.
I go to church every Sunday.
I thought I was a good Christian.
I go to church every Sunday. I'm a very religious person.
I thought I was a good Christian.
The very line the serpent told to Eve in the Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden. The gospel of Jesus Christ. Spread confusion and promote lies. The gospel of Jesus Christ. Spread confusion and promote lies. The gospel of Jesus Christ. Spread confusion and promote lies. The gospel of Jesus Christ. Spread confusion and promote lies. The gospel of Jesus Christ. Spread confusion and promote.
Hey everybody, this is Zombie Popcorn's This Non-Religious Life. This is Bob. Today is Thursday, January 19th. With me, as always, is Jason.
Hello.
And all the way across the country, lacking a video feed because we're technically short. But
We're not
we
technically
have always
short.
this
They just have to
10.
pay for stuff to get it.
Yeah.
And I'm
Hey, everybody.
And we have a guest with us today. His name is Matt Brake, and he is a Master of Divinity. And I'll let him say a little bit about himself. Matt, say hi.
Hi.
Hello. Welcome. Thank you for coming on the show.
I feel like I'm on Delicious Dish.
Yeah. That's what I'm going for.
I always thought of it as The View, but that's all right.
So yeah, just a few words about kind of like what I said like a minute ago,
Yeah, right, exactly. Just like that.
but for posterity's sake now.
Yes, please.
Master of Divinity. I graduated with my MDiv in '09. Before that, had a year. Well, before that, I attended a Bible college in upstate New York that no one's ever heard of. And actually, in between that college experience and my seminary work, I went through a year of really finding myself and determining whether or not if this Christian life was what I wanted to do. Although before that, when I was younger, I'd had a pretty intense conversion experience and a sense of wanting to be in Christian ministry. So yeah.
So, can you tell us about your conversion experience? Because you piqued my interest with that.
Pretty much I was just raised in church all my life and raised as a Christian. But the experience I had was I went to another church in my area where I grew up, and when I was there, I just kept on having these really intense experiences of God's presence, which started off as a sense of just an acknowledgement, a sense of that my heart wasn't right with God. And there were times where I would just feel like God's presence would kind of just fall on me like a blanket, and I would just start to cry. And I guess I should throw a disclaimer that there was music playing. I know sometimes that can be the whole emotional cue issue, but beyond, I think there's a place for sacred song, but that's a whole different discussion. But I definitely, from that experience, just became very zealous for God after that. And then not too long after that, I felt a call into ministry. But that's kind of the short version of the conversion experience.
Okay. All right. Well, that's really interesting. The reason I wanted to have you on the show is you and I struck up a conversation about this. Is that we've talked on the show about the philosophical ideas that are put out by guys like William Lane Craig, and and as I'm not a philosophy major, I went to school. I'm an engineer, and so a lot of times I get lost in the philosophical rhetoric that William Lane Craig uses. I mean, just some of the language in and of itself, like, spins me around in circles, and I just thought it would be interesting to have somebody on to clarify the things that he said, and we could have a discussion about it. And you turned around and gave me the Francis Collins book, was it The Language of God?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which was great. That was a really good read. Now, I don't agree with what he has to say about a lot of things, but but it makes for a good discussion. I don't have to necessarily, buy it all.
Yeah.
And I was hoping that we could talk a little bit about Collins's two big points, or his would appear to me to be his two main lines of thinking, and that would be the anthropic principle and moral law.
Yeah.
And we did have a discussion about that in the last couple of shows. We sort of danced around it a little bit. But to kick it off, on our previous show, we had some comment left. And the guy said, he left it on the YouTube site, and he said that he has a question for us. This is from a listener. And he says, would you agree that just because science can prove many things to be true or untrue, it can't prove something unknown to be one way or the other? In this case, the unknown would be some sort of God that might have created everything, or gods. And then they I guess they got a little second-guessing themselves, and they sent another comment to rephrase their question. And they said, if science can't prove that God does not exist, or not yet at least, then do you keep that possibility, not probability, of God existing in the back of your head? I mean, if you believe in a scientific method, you need to prove one way or the other that something exists or doesn't. So I think what the thrust of their question is that even if you allow that one day science could prove the existence of a God, does that mean that you have to think in terms that the possibility exists that there is a God? And I thought I'd give you first crack at it.
Can you repeat the question one more time?
I think where they're going is that the way I sort of thought about it was they're thinking like we always said that there's things that science can and can't prove, and then we always put the caveat yet. Mm-hmm. And I think that they're saying, well, we say that they're envisioning a time when science can indeed prove the existence or disprove the existence of God. But until that happens, whatever way you think, you have to allow the possibility that there is a God, even if you believe that there isn't. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I think just to the issue of can science ever prove there's a God, I think my initial thought to that would probably be a humble no, at least from a Judeo-Christian framework. And I feel that needs to be qualified just by saying two things. I think one, again, from the Judeo-Christian framework, you're dealing with a God who, from the outright, reveals himself as breath and wind, and there's this kind of trend from Genesis through until through the end of Revelation of the Ruach of God and the Spirit and the breath and the invisible presence, and don't make an empty idol out of your own hands, but relate to the invisible presence of God and so forth. So I think, first off, in terms of if science is about proving the physical universe, evaluating the physical universe and so on, I think it's always going to be hard to prove there's a God. Now, I throw that out there. Now, if we are going to talk about proving a God, I mean, when we start getting into the issues of neuroscience and how God changes your brain and evaluating religious experiences, whether people are having them, evaluating testimonies of the miraculous and so on. I mean, again, you can maybe prove a probability of God through eyewitness testimony and so forth, but even then that just lends itself to human error. So I think you and I have talked about this, Bob, in terms of just the fact that I'm not sure God can be proven by the scientific method as being anything other than probable. And there's always that element with faith where it's that blind trust in the invisible voice of God, and I don't think with faith you'll ever get that certainty outside of the faith walk and relational walk itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. I think I see where you're going with it. I think the listener had a good point, but I think that it it misconstrues the way science works a little bit, in that rarely, if ever, in the history of science has there been, and like I said, this was me framing it a little bit, but rarely, if ever, in science has there been one experiment that determined anything. It's not just one experiment. It's actually many observations over time. And what happens is those observations are like arrows all pointing in the same direction. And for me, as an atheist, I find that those arrows are pointing in a direction away from God. Those all of those observations that are being made are decreasing the possibility that there even needs to be a God, and it's, you know, the necessity of God is diminishing.
Now, I guess with that, when you say that, could you throw out a couple of those observations? Because I mean, what, you know, they're kind of broad. I mean, that could mean a lot of things. Some people would, you know, talk about, is it the problem of evil issue, or is it just the scientific explanations for the way the world works, or what part of?
Well, I'm thinking more along the lines of the scientific explanations for the way the world works. You know, 2,000 years ago, you know, prior to the scientific method, there was a lot of things that were unexplained, and those were attributed to God. And now we know how those things work. And even religious experience itself is being found to be a biologic phenomenon.
Yeah, I think with the religious experience thing, again, you know, with, you know, especially with Judeo-Christian thought, you're dealing a lot with seen and unseen. In terms of the biological response to religious experience, I think there's actually a really great book by Amos Young and James K. Called Science and Spirit. It's kind of a beginning and ongoing dialogue between the whole faith science group. It talks about the issues of neuroscience and so forth, and some of the conclusions.
Hey,
Whatever
Matt,
that is,
I'm
that's
having trouble hearing
yeah,
you.
it's whatever that is drowning you out. I don't know if it's coming from you or Ken, but we can't hear you with all that.
Hey, Ken, are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is what's going on? Is it on your end, or is it Matt? Is it you?
It might be on my end.
Okay.
Well, can you mute?
Sure.
Because we can't hear him at all.
Okay. Sorry.
That's all right. I was like, what?
So what part? From the beginning?
Yes, please.
I was just saying that with religious experience, I think it's one of those deals where there's a great book by James K. Smith, and Bob, I can let you borrow this at some point.
Sure.
James K. Smith and Amos Young, called Science and Spirit, and it's a book of essays, and some of them deal with the whole the issue of religious experience and the activity in the brain and so on, which I think even with evolution, like it doesn't show the invisible hand of God in the middle, but it does show the human body reacting to it. I mean, part of the problem when we talk about, to say that because there's a biological response, it eliminates the need for God or the probability of God. I think it comes from a very flawed, almost kind of Platonic view of man, of almost like, instead of the whole seen and unseen, we've changed it to, we've created this weird spirit material dichotomy in man, when I'm not sure man was meant to be compartmentalized between his body and his invisible self and so on. So that'd be my one thought with religious experience. My one other comment would just have to do with this idea of, I do agree that there, you know, I would say there is a difference between the supernatural and the superstitious. It's one thing when God is related to us as a presence and as a pure, invisible relationship and so on. versus like, I'm trying to think of a good example of a superstition that, like some idea of like, because we bury souls, hell must be below us between the pillars of the earth, or some ancient cosmology that just lacks the evidence for really understanding how the world works.
Yeah, but you know, I see that as a distinct trend over time. It just seems to me that and you know, Collins makes this argument in his books too. I mean, he sort of thinks along those lines. You know, he sort of, I don't know. To me, it almost seems a God of the gaps argument, and I can't help but notice the trend that the gaps are diminishing.
Mm-hmm. What would be a good example of the diminishing gap?
That noise.
Yeah, that noise. Well, you know, like,
Ken, are you doing all right, buddy?
Yeah, I'm fine.
What
I'm
the
just listening to you guys talk.
Yeah, but we can't hear it.
it sounds like Ken's jumping up and down on his computer.
No, my cats are running around, so
I was about to say, do you and a dog who's very happy?
I have a cat who thinks she's a dog.
In
Well,
some
that
of our
works.
videos, Ken's talking, and then like his cat inexplicably walks across the screen.
Yeah. 9 out of 10 times when we're filming, I have a cat in my lap for half the show.
You're like crazy cat guy.
Kinda. Well, only in that I have crazy cats.
Yeah, right.
Anyway, I'm sorry, Bob.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
To pick up where Bob left off, to talk about the diminishing gaps, I think every time science has taken a step forward, it has replaced sections of an explanation of the universe that was previously filled with God. When you talk about the replacing of geocentrism with heliocentrism, when you're talking about the dating of the universe, when you're talking about physics and astronomy and chemistry and biology, continually you can see that if your definition of God is that which we cannot currently explain, or that which is perceived at that time as unexplainable, then really your definition of God is little more than pockets of temporary scientific ignorance. 2,000 years ago, we knew almost nothing about the world around us. It really was a testament that we could do the things we could do, and obviously people need, we have inquisitive minds, and the reason why, we go to school and we read books and we do all these things is we have these inquisitive minds that want to know answers. I don't think any of us likes not understanding something. So it seems that religion, and it's occurred this way in every culture, which is why I don't give Christianity a pass over Hinduism or over Buddhism or over Shinto or any, extent paganism, is that they all function the same way in society to explain pockets of ignorance about the universe that we have for any number of reasons.
I think my one thought with that, I mean, if we are talking about religion I'm not especially when it comes to scriptures, I'm not anything like an inerrantist. Like, I understand that something like the Bible for me isn't meant to be a textbook on other areas, and I think that's where the mistake is often made in the history of religion, where the purpose of the sacred text we have, that I have as a Christian, that other religions have, but I'm specifically dealing with just my own in this situation. One of the things that acts as is a history of, especially, and this might be a little more uniquely Christian, or at least Judeo-Christian, it has to do with relating to Yahweh, how one relates to Yahweh. So the questions of age of the earth, biology, etc., are these little side tangents within the text, when the text itself is much more about relating to Yahweh, relating to the voice that's being heard, and then answering the question, how should we then live? So I understand the whole issue of the superstition and ancient cosmology and how that messes with people's science, which I don't think exists because of religion. I think it exists because of the lack of knowledge about those things. And then, at some point, cosmology kind of works into people's, view of the world. But again, the Bible isn't a text about cosmology. It's a text of how to relate to Yahweh. Although you have to understand there is a lens through which the Hebrews wrote about those religious experiences they were having. Whether those get trumped up or not from generation to generation and how that happens is a whole other thing. But there's a really good book by a guy named Peter Enns. He's another one of the BioLogos guys, called Inspiration and Incarnation. And actually, his new book, I think he's actually going to be on The Daily Show or Colbert with this, is The Evolution of Adam. Both kind of dealing with that, the issue of interpretation in the light of ancient cosmology and so on. So, sorry, I know that was a bit of a mouthful.
No, that's fine. Keep going. You're doing good. Wouldn't you wouldn't characterize yourself as an inerrantist? I can't say it. You wouldn't characterize yourself as to espousing the inerrancy of the Bible.
No, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that, at least one form of inerrancy has to do with the idea that the Bible is this scientific handbook that was handed down. For me, I would see it more as, I would use the word inspired, which is a lot more esoteric. Actually, truth be told, if I do a PhD, it'll probably be in Nottingham, and it'll probably be about this very topic.
Well, good.
Because the issue of inspiration is a lot more about the idea of God breathed, which is a theme in Scripture and a theme in Judeo-Christian theology. This idea of this inspiration of God, like Adam is inspired and he becomes a living soul, which, taking Genesis allegorically as I do, I see it as the Hebrews, making a statement about the nature of God, the nature of man, and possibly even having a lot in there to say about their own exile out of their promised land and all sorts of other stuff. But there's this idea, and with Adam specifically, of the Hebrew saying man was inspired by God. There was some, like, man was made from the same creaturely essence as the other creatures, but then he was uniquely inspired. And so this idea of the inspired people, the inspired text, the inspired people writing the inspired text, and God really, you see it even in the Exodus story of, like, there was this group of people who started prophesying in the tent, and all these people got mad and were like, no, Moses, this is only you. And Moses is like, well, I wish everyone would be like this, which is the ultimate promise of Joel and the New Testament scriptures, is it's this idea of all people get to be inspired, get to be divinely inspired by God, and they get a fresh sense of Ruach, and of the Spirit and so on. But this is a very unrefined dissertation proposal, so.
No, that's fine. All of Scripture, in and of itself, inerrancy used to be a pillar of the religion. Inerrancy was almost the foundation of Christianity. And,
for fundamentalists.
Well, I'm just thinking historically too. And now, today, Christians have to cede inerrancy. They have to give it up. They have to walk away from it, or at least rationalize it. And I see this trend of religion ceding ground to secularism over time, and not just secularism, but scientific explanations in general, where eventually the the naturalistic worldview will run out of things to explain, and even in that scenario, religious experience itself can be explained. So, what's left for God?
I guess that well, that's I think in terms of the inerrancy, again, going back to inerrancy, I mean, inerrancy is a very modern word in terms of its usage and some of its understanding. I think when you go back and look at people like Augustine, Origen, and others, there's this sense of, I mean, even Augustine, you know, and I think Collins mentions this a little bit. You know, Augustine, you know, isn't the, you know, flaming liberal I'd want to paint him to be. Far from it. But one of the things he is and he says is, you know, we have to keep in mind the proper interpretation of the text and not assume things about which we might be ignorant and say, well, it has to be this way because Scripture says. And even with Scripture, I mean, if we're going to talk about inerrancy in terms of how it's been applied to Genesis 1 through 3, you're talking about, number one, bad hermeneutics. It's obviously poetic. It's obviously allegory. There's a lot of biblical criticism that can be done on that, and it can still be inspired regardless of that. I think in terms of, you know what, I just had a brain fart, so I'll just pause there for a moment. Oh, religious experience. Nope, brain fart, I'm done.
All right, good. How was that?
So eloquent at the end.
Yes.
That's what you expect from our show.
That's two brain farts.
I don't know, like, I see the rationalization of inerrancy and where Christians now are freely admitting that, oh, well, it is allegory and it is inspired, however, not inerrant. I see that as a relatively new thing, and I see that as just one more concession to the naturalistic worldview, because I have to give that up. And then now with the recent discussion, I mean, and when I say recent, right, so it's 150 years, but with the recent advancement of evolution, that's another concession that has to be made, and even Collins makes it. And I think that in Collins's arguments about that with the moral law, as I understand his argument to be for moral law, that as humans we are inspired by God, and we have traits that make us uniquely human. But now you read news stories and science articles all the time where we're finding traits in animals that we used to think were uniquely human. We used to think that we were the only ones that behaved this way, and now we're finding evidence of that in animals. For instance, they've done studies that show that dogs have a sense of fair play, and rats have a sense of empathy. And these were traits that at one point, fairly recently, were thought to be uniquely human. And so I just see every little scientific advancement as eroding that moral foundation, or the foundation of moral law.
But the sparrow does not fall from the side of God.
I think probably how I would respond, going back real quick to the inerrancy issue, and then jumping into that issue of science and how it's showing what the uniqueness of humans factor. I think one of the things we have to keep in mind, again, with the whole inerrancy argument, is that's a very modern argument and done largely as a fundamentalist regrouping response. You know, it was kind of a response to what was seen as a growing secularism in America, that whole sort of like bunkering down, even using the word inerrancy, like that's not a very ancient understanding of the Bible where we take it and then say, you know, this is I mean, I understand there was the whole issue of the cosmology and some of the Aristotelianism that the church didn't want to give up with Galileo and everything. And that had to do with Aristotelian ethics and so on. But I would see especially in the U.S., like the U.S. is filled with all these these anti-intellectual fundamentalists who want to fight for inerrancy and have this, and they're very modern. There's a very modernistic sense of like, hey, here's my complete system of thought. I don't like dealing with paradoxes. And then, you know, a lot of them are Calvinists, actually, who are all sola scriptura, inerrancy, double predestination, and so on. And they present this entire, you know, this entire well-defined system of doctrine that I'm not sure even the Bible proposes with itself, because the Bible is very dialectic in its style. So it's not this straightforward, logical, linear book. So that was the first thing I was going to say. The second thing I think had to do with, again, the issue of the uniqueness of humans. You know, with even the fair play, it was not too long ago I began to kind of look around at some of the relationships and friend circles I ran in, and kind of looked at and saw like, okay, there's a pecking order here. Like, we might as well be a bunch of roosters pecking each other on the nose, because I know my place. Or in the face, wherever they peck. And it was one of those realizations, and I think Genesis, again, as a theological document, helps us to understand that, you know, mankind is an animal. Like, we're created from, and this is more of a theological understanding of the terms, not necessarily the literal scientific. We're all created from dust. We all have a mutual creatureliness with every being on earth. I think the difference and what's very unique to humanity is this, the religious experience factor, the hearing the voice factor, which in the end is really how Yahweh seems to reveal himself in the Old Testament. Again, is the voice, the ruach, the breath, which either means that a lot of people have been crazy for millennia, which is possible, or that there is this invisible voice and this idea of revelation and ruach that the Jews just happen to pick up on.
Well, wouldn't you say that the diversity of religion in the world would just be evidence that religious experience is strictly a biologic phenomenon? Because if it was Yahweh all over the world, which Christianity affirms that Yahweh is the one and only, then there wouldn't be other world religions.
I think my one thought would have to, well, a couple, I think two, which has to do with the idea of spiritual malevolence. I think one, to realize that there might be a spiritual dualism in the world. So just because an experience is spiritual doesn't mean it's a God.
Oh, yes. Jesus.
So, just to repeat that point.
One more
Yeah.
time.
Oh, my God.
Just because a experience is spiritual doesn't mean it's Yahweh, because there might be other parties involved.
But
And then
doesn't
two,
that-
the issue of also the nature of man, and does man really, man might have spiritual impulses, but does man really want to know, does man want God on God's terms? So that would be kind of two negative thoughts. A positive I want to throw out there is to say that, just kind of throwing out the idea of like Clark Pinnock and Wideness of God's Mercy and John Sanders and no other name, just this idea of, you know, God might be working within those religions in spite of those religions, and especially with Hinduism. I mean, at some point you're talking about universal Brahman and Nirvana and kind of these big picture ideas of like, you know, are those things the right God understood wrongly and impersonally? Or, I mean, when it comes to the whole comparative religious thing, I mean, that opens a whole other can of worms, but
Yeah, but,
I hope that makes sense.
It does, and I think I understand your arguments correctly, but wouldn't, what did you call it, the spiritual malevolency? Is that the idea of like a Satan or some kind of agent of evil?
Right, which...
Doesn't that undermine monotheism?
Well, I think even within Jewish monotheism, that doesn't even necessarily rule out lesser gods. It's just it might even be more of a henotheism, where it's understood that Yahweh is just the one above them all. Because it was kind of understood you had the divine council and this idea, this understanding of other spiritual entities existing, which to the Hebrews and other ancient cultures were seen as gods. But this idea that Yahweh was the creator, and that's why even with his name you have the El Shaddai, the Almighty. You have the idea of El Elyon, the highest power, and even just the way he gets defined in Exodus as "I will be who I will be," or what I will be. So there's this idea of like Yahweh is seen as far more all-encompassing, and I mean, even then you get into this idea of spiritual, invisible powers and so on, which has also all sorts of implications for like other dimensions and stuff. But that's again a whole other can of worms.
Well, I just, like the perception. I mean, I guess that would go to say that would you say that the perception of Christianity as being strictly monotheistic, is that an improper understanding? Is that wrong?
I think with all things, unfortunately, you end up with the dichotomy between popular understanding and scholarly understanding, which takes into account a lot more historical context and so on. And it almost sounds kind of snobby and elitist to put it like that. But I think there could be, in some ways, I think a lot of Christians and a lot of religious people in general have pegged themselves in and backed themselves in a corner when they really don't need to. Here, honestly, my biggest frustration as someone who really loves Jesus and really thinks I know God and really enjoys evangelical church services is that if every thought I had was shared about my theology as it's grown over time, I would probably be considered at least kind of a heretic in some circles, or not seen as trustworthy, even though I know that there are people who struggle with their faith, and it's because they've been given this fundamentalist, theology book that covers all the bases, but does so without any real interdisciplinary knowledge, and ends up really causing people to lose faith because they don't know that they can adapt, and they don't see all the historical context. They're given a very small view of God. In fact, I told someone the other day, like doing philosophy at a secular school, doing the whole philosophy of religion thing was so freeing from a Christian school, because in some ways, and understand I say this a little tongue-in-cheek, to be able to talk about God without confining him by Scripture was very freeing. Even though I love Scripture and I see it as inspired, it was just this thing of like, and I wrote a blog, matthewbreak.tumblr.com, where I talked about this idea of how Christians are so, especially post-Reformation, are so focused on Scripture that they fail to see God in creation, modeled in relationships and so on. They're very bad at seeing the aesthetic and the beautiful and how that points to God, because they're so focused on having to be right that they don't know how to really live. And so that's a personal frustration on my part that I'm not sure I've articulated well, but I thought I would just share that.
No, that's again, it's well said. I had a thought when I was reading the Collins book, and one of the things I thought was really interesting is that Collins goes a long way to give evolution the soft sell. He's really trying to get the fundamentalist Christian on his side. He was like, it's okay, you can believe in evolution and still, have a faith in God. And he was really, it just seemed like he was really trying to pitch that to to the evangelical Christian, because that seems to be a point where a lot of Christians have a problem. And he paints this picture that that we have evolved according to God's plan and we're this perfect product in God's image. But if you accept that evolution has occurred, wouldn't that mean that you have to accept that evolution will continue to occur, which I maintain that it will? And if all of the science is right, then the Earth has been around for millions of years, and hopefully the Earth will be around for millions more. And in a million years, we will be vastly different than what we are now. A million years is a long time. And how do you rationalize thinking that forward thought with this idea that we're God's creation now?
I mean, it kind of helps that, you know, even if we evolve, I mean, we're still pretty finite creatures. I mean, in terms of how, hey, telepathy would be kind of cool. So if we evolve to that, I mean,
well, not just mental abilities and acuity. I'm talking about like we would be biologically different. In a million years, speciation will occur, and there will be Homo sapien, whatever. It will be some different breed of humans that is a completely different species than what we are now. So is that God's plan? Is, you know, where's that going to go? I think that it's short-sighted.
I mean, again, I can't speak for the future. I mean, I don't think it necessarily disproves God. I mean, either way, like there's still, I don't know if we'll outgrow the religious experience factor or the oceanic religious feeling that religious experience brings, and whether that's some leftover from the primordial past. The short answer would be no. I don't think it would. The second answer would be, I really hope I'm Cyclops, because Cyclops was my favorite X-Men.
Yeah. Right. The next evolution. What was that in X-Men? It was Homo sapien superior.
Homo superior and
Homo superior.
Well, is it Homo sapien superior? Yeah, it might be 3-part.
Yeah, it was something like that. But even then, that wasn't. I mean, you know, X-Men comics are cool to talk about. I dig that. But that wasn't speciation, because, you know, the mutants and the non-mutants could get together and still have kids. Speciation occurs when you no longer have viable offspring. And
well, I mean, even I think they've even shown that Neanderthal man might have bred with Homo sapiens. I mean,
that's been shown. Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know. I mean, in terms of, again, we have yet to see how unique humanity could be. All we know is that we've kind of landed on the moon. You know what I mean? You know what I mean? Like compared to like compared to other primates and so on, like we definitely have something special about us, which is why, again, for me, the issue of God comes down to an issue of meaning as well. Like, I'm not sure that the scientific method gives a strong sense of meaning or a good foundation for things like ethics and so on. I think there is I think that spiritual, like, and I think Collins talks about this, between the moral law, which, and even beyond that, the longing for God, between, and this whole idea of like the foundation for both of those things. I think I'd like to see those things explained well. And why now for me, my theistic answer would be to say that those are the things that connect us to God. That's part of the issue of being human. That's part of what it means to be made in the image, is that, God is able to relate to himself, and we're invited into that. So to have a capacity for relationship to God, even though we are made earthy and low to the ground, that's what makes us unique. And if God is God, it's hard for me to see a further developed human-ish creature out-developing that. That would be my initial thought. I mean, again, when it comes down to how man is made in the image of God, like, it's relating to that voice and then being able to represent that voice's interest on earth is what makes man unique. Which doesn't answer the speciation question necessarily, but but again, I think with part of that, I just kind of fall on the line of, I mean, with that, I just don't know. I mean,
Well, it's fair to not know it. That's okay. I mean, none of us know. I was just thinking. I was just, like, I don't know, just because, and again, thinking about another Collins argument about the anthropic principle, this idea that the universe is finely tuned, just so for our existence. And I've heard other guys who are, the big guns in astronomy. I think it was it Hawking, or maybe it was it Tyson that said, like, if there's anything that the universe is uniquely tuned for, it's for making black holes, and we're just a happy byproduct of all of that. And like, if this really is God's plan involved 14.4 billion years of nothing, and then another I don't know, however many millions of years the Earth is. What would we say the Earth is? How many millions?
The Earth is roughly 4 billion years old.
yeah, 4.5 billion or whatever.
Oh, all right, so
Yeah.
so then there's billions of years of evolutionary struggle. Nature red in tooth and claw to get to here, where we have humans walking around thinking about God, and we're only here for our time in the geologic scale is fleeting at best. And even if you move forward, or even if you don't think about moving forward, there's all this time to get us here. And I don't know, I just, some guys, I don't know, they might say, like, well, you just can't know the mind of God, but it just seems like a bad plan.
It's like, yes, can I give you a cliche answer? How about?
Yeah.
I mean, even if you look at, and disclaimer, I don't buy a literal Genesis creation narrative or anything, but I would say that even within that narrative, you get this idea of, again, man kind of comes last after a whole week of, like, everything else happening. So it's kind of like, okay, well, glad we finally got here. It's Friday. So God, created us on the same day that Rebecca Black decided to make up a song, which is cool. So, I mean, even with that, you have this idea. But even, I think even, Psalms admits a very humble position of man. I mean, the whole idea of, man, while unique, is still kind of reminded of his and her humble place. I mean, whether it's when I view the heavens, why am I here? Like, how am I sure I'm not crazy to think that you see me right now? So you have that element, or even the whole idea of even the Hebrews, even God's special chosen people, it still is derived from this idea of dirt and earthiness and humility. Like, there's still this idea of, even Ecclesiastes, the one existentialist book in the entire Bible, is kind of like, God is in heaven and here am I on earth. Huh. So
see, my take in thinking along those lines is what I gather from the evidence is that man is not unique. I mean, we think we're unique, but it turns out we're not. There's other there's other biologic creatures out there, and they all share traits with us, and we all share a common ancestor, and we're not unique. And I don't think that we do come from a position of humility and have a humble nature. I mean, we are, stand up, great ape, because you have survived all of this time, and you're not unique, but that's part of what makes you special. Is that you're here now.
Well, and I think too, when I talk, what was the in terms of humility, I'm not talking about an inner posture of humility. I think it's more of like like, oh man, I'm kind of small in the universe, and I kind of realize that. I think in terms of, okay, new phrase. I think in the realm of, what you said about the whole unique and special factor. I mean, I would say that I'm not going to put down man that much because I think, whether we talk about language or the ability to build civilization or scientific achievement, like the capacity of the mind, the capacity to take dominance over other creatures. I mean, I think, there are some things you could point to as being unique, especially human, but I think, yeah, I mean, I think you could argue for, I mean, we're definitely at least in some ways smarter. I mean, again, like moon landing smarter. Um,
Well,
but even then, I would acknowledge, and again, I think Genesis does as well. And again, thinking about that as like this narrative understanding of how the Hebrews understood God, overall in history, is this idea that, mankind shares creatureliness with other creatures. Like, I don't dispute that. Man's specialness is, and really specialness in the Bible and in Judeo-Christian thought is the specialness of relating to God. Like, that's what makes man special.
well, I mean, we say that because we're sitting around talking about it, but we can't know the mind of every other creature out there. And I'm not saying, my goldfish contemplates God, because I doubt that happens.
But your dog is really cute, though. So, I mean,
yeah. but it's hard to, I mean, without knowing the mind of every other organism out there, it's hard to, I don't know if I buy that claim. And I don't know, like just every day we find out that there's patterns of thought that we used to think were uniquely human. And it wouldn't surprise me one day if we find out that maybe chimpanzees have an inkling of some kind of greater power. The same way we think about it. And that would just be one more thing taken away from our position on top of the pile. I mean, well, not taking it away, but it would be one more, brick kicked out of the wall.
Yeah. Well, I guess, I mean, even with that, I mean, I'm not sure that would disprove God. I think that would be more of a matter of, I mean, obviously God is able to relate to, I mean, obviously if he's the potter, we're the clay and so on, I mean, he can kind of relate to his creatures as he sees fit. So, I mean, even you have the story, and I understand it's a story, and, the whole, like, the talking ass and so on, you know what I mean? So there's this idea of, like, I think I'd kind of fall with Francis of Assisi and some of the modern environmental Christian movements when, they talk about how we've kind of treated creation like crap and really downplayed its importance. So I'm not gonna dispute, you have those stories of Francis of Assisi, like, and the birds coming to it, you know what I mean? Like, and I'm enough of a believer in the supernatural to think that maybe some of those myths might be based on truth, and who knows what a life really dedicated to God would look like, if God's supernatural power is available.
Well, isn't the belief that God's supernatural power is available through prayer?
It is, and part of that comes with and prayer is being able to relate to God, and God changing us in prayer, and then us going out and being able to represent Him on earth, truth, justice, the American way. Well, maybe not the American way, but you know what I mean. Mercy, yeah, mercy. We'll go with mercy.
I don't know. I just I don't see. You talk about the power of God being available to prayer. I think that you mentioned the supernatural, and I think that the supernatural, like, one, I don't see any evidence for it, and two, if there were evidence for it, it would undermine all of science as we know it today. Because the whole natural world, as it has been well defined, as we know it today, functions on the very nature, on the very, it relies on there not being a supernatural element, and we've bounced this idea around before that if you were a researcher and you were conducting an experiment, the we have to have the assurance that your experiment will work the same for everybody, no matter who they are or where they are, all over the world, despite any prayers that were said to the contrary.
Well, and I want to point out that, I mean, we can talk about the whole evidence for supernatural thing. I want to point out that when I'm speaking about power available through prayer, I'm talking about inspiration, spiritual vitality, and so on. And I'm sure there could be talk there about the relationship to things like meditation. But this idea of prayer as the vehicle to relate to God, not simply as a petitionary request. Which we can talk about the whole issue of, I mean, again, C.S. Lewis's Miracles is probably going to treat it more in depth, the whole issue of the rationale for miracles versus, Hume's against miracles type of thing. But that would be my one thought about prayer is I want to make sure two things aren't done. I want to make sure that, first I want to make sure that's under, in terms of personally where I'm coming from is, I'm not seeing the Bible as this inerrant instruction book it's not an interdisciplinary instruction book. It's a way of understanding relating to God. And likewise, prayer is primarily in that same function, versus being a petitionary slot machine. It's more of a matter of receiving marching orders and moving forward than it is about, throwing dice and hoping you get lucky. So I do want to throw out that little caveat. Yeah.
Well, I mean that. Okay.
Thoughts?
Well, no. I mean, and if when you say that, then that puts, then we're both in the minority because it turns out that the majority of Americans today believe in the power of prayer. If you were to take a poll, most Americans would say, "Yes, I believe in the power of prayer," and they don't, and they don't mean it in the relationship aspect. They mean it as like God is gonna come down and alter the laws of physics for their benefit.
Yeah.
I mean that's the whole all of prosperity ministry is based upon that.
Well, and again, I would kind of say that the danger with Christian ministry, and in terms of, I mean, you mentioned the prosperity guys. The difference between a popular understanding of theology and a scholarly understanding of theology goes a long way. And unfortunately, most Americans are also, I mean, they might say they believe in the power of prayer, but they're also very illiterate when it comes to their own faith, according to Barna and Gallup and so on. So,
yeah.
So I mean, it's a sign of anything. It's a sign of immaturity. Or if anything, excuse me, it's either a sign of immaturity or it's a sign of just pretended faith and a lack of real belief. So hopefully just the former, not the latter.
Yeah, this whole discussion has been really good, and I really appreciate your viewpoint because I like that you've made the point a couple times that's this belief in scholarly versus popular belief, because I'm not a Bible scholar, I'm not a divinity scholar, and so the only gauge I have to measure is what I see in the popular world around me, and I admit that I'll concede those differences, but I don't see the academics pushing in the other direction, or I'm sorry, pushing in the direction that you're going. In fact, I see it going the other way. It's becoming, the popular beliefs are taking hold and becoming more prevalent. And I don't know, I mean, we're both going to be on the same side of the fence at the end of the day.
I mean, the one thing I would say about those who have, those who hold popular beliefs, like, at the end of the day, like, I have family members. I mean, I have my own father who believes very similarly, if not the same, about Jesus, if not the same about, at least on paper, the nature of God and so on. But, it's one of those things where, I love my father and I can say, hey, I can relate to you as a Christian in some ways, but I know at some level, like I might have decided to go a little further up the mountain than you in some ways. And you're not going to believe me when I tell you I saw a three-headed goat, but I saw a three-headed goat up the mountain. You know what I mean? And he's going to disagree with me because of his personality, of how he's been taught, and so on. Even though we're both climbing the same mountain, I've just seen some ledges he might not have seen. So, in terms of other people, the more popular ideas, like in the end, I mean, I would say it's almost one of those things where you look at your family and crazy Uncle Jack is in prison and Aunt Sue is drinking too much. And, you look and you say, okay, like, I'm embarrassed. This could be different, but they're still my family. So I think with the popular versus the scholarly, I don't want to draw a sharp line between myself and them, but I really, really want Uncle Jack or whatever to stop drinking or get out of prison. You know what I mean?
Right, sure, but right, you can see that metaphor. You're not going to give drunk Aunt Susie the car keys.
Well, unfortunately, drunk Aunt Susie told the entire family I was a heretic. So
she's going to take the car keys.
Exactly. The entire family said, no, she's fine.
Yeah. Well, man, it's just an hour goes by really quick. I've really enjoyed the discussion, and maybe we'll have to continue it or do it again or have come up with another reason to have you back. But we're about out of time.
We are out of time.
Real quick, anybody got any last thoughts?
No, I've really liked this discussion. I think you definitely have to come back because we don't get too many believers on here, and it's always good to have a different perspective brought to light for us to discuss. Otherwise, it just turns into the three of us prattling on about stuff.
Yeah.
And stroking our egos. One thing I do want to do is if you have anything online that you want to plug, now's the time to do it. You can, if you have a blog that you mentioned earlier or whatever, something our listeners can go check out.
Your blog address.
Yeah, it's just matthewbrake.tumblr.com, matthewbrake @tumblr.com or .tumblr.com. And yeah, so occasionally I decide to write and post it there. So other than that, I don't have that big of a web footprint. So.
Well, cool.
Yeah. Well, what we'll have to do is, like, most of the discussion has been, where you and I, where the discussion, we know how you feel about things and your beliefs and your personal stance on our issues. I think maybe another episode would be to tackle like a social issue at large and see where you come down on those, like things, just what's going on in the world today.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. I love that.
Rick Perry just writes the jokes himself, man. We don't even have to. I just read the news.
There's enough of me that's just become a pacifist, conscientious objector. So I'm whatever. Yeah.
He's the drunk Aunt Susie.
Yeah. Speaking of Rick Perry, really quick, I just got my phone's not updating my emails for some reason, although it is being loud during the show. And the response, this is what got us going, guys. It was today.
Was it
North
really?
Carolina.
Yeah, in South Carolina.
I
response.
sent you the email about it.
We'll have
I know.
to.
I just got the
I
email.
have a whole calendar of it that are in our area.
So cool.
So.
Next time it comes around, you guys have to go. Heads up.
All right. Well,
Pack it up or road trip.
Well, Matt, this has been really good. It's been I think it's been productive and enlightening all at the same time. We'll definitely have to have you back if you'll come back.
Absolutely.
The next time you can actually come in, it's just...
It was late.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm in my
Yeah.
underwear and
Yeah.
not really.
Late night pajama party.
Woo!
Yeah.
All right. So I guess we'll take us out now. So for all the listeners out there, if you have any questions or you want to comment on something you heard said on the show, or you want to ask why I'm so cheap that I don't pay for Skype and I can't have a video up when we have a multiple call.
No, back up. Wait. What I need you to do is buy a headset and a microphone.
Yeah.
Stop using the external microphones. Anyway, go ahead.
It'll cut down on the cat noise.
Yeah.
I'll fucking buy one
We'll
for
get on
you.
that. You can call us. We have a phone number. You can leave a voicemail. It's the Zombie Popcorn Hotline, 757-337-2195. You can email us, nonreligious@zombie-popcorn.com. You can like us on Facebook, facebook.com/thisnonreligiouslife. You can put us in your circles on Google+. You can check out our stuff on iTunes and download it there. Stitcher Radio, we were just on the homepage. So thanks to everyone for listening there. But you can just stream our show live there. No downloading or syncing required aside from the app itself. And everything else is on the site. So you can go there and sign up for the mailing list. And about once a week, we send out an email just letting you know what all the recent shows were about. And yeah, so that's it.
Very good. Matt, we can still
Matthew?
be friends, right?
Yeah, thanks for coming on again.
my pleasure. And let me give you an ironic God bless you.
Yeah. Thanks.
Somebody sneeze?
Yeah. All right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Just got out here.
I thought I was a good Christian.
Jesus died on a cross. I go to church every Sunday. Just got out here. Then I read that Jesus died on a cross for a rotten hooker.
I thought I was a good Christian.
I go to church every Sunday.
I thought I was a good Christian.
I go to church every Sunday. I'm a very religious person.
I thought I was a good Christian.
The very lies the serpent told to Eve in the Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden. The gospel of Jesus Christ. Spread confusion and promote lies. The gospel of Jesus Christ. Spread confusion and promote lies. The gospel of Jesus Christ. Spread confusion and promote lies. The gospel of Jesus Christ. Spread confusion and promote lies.